Throw a stone in the pool that is sci-fi media, and it's almost impossible not to hit something influenced by Frank Herbert's genre-defining novel, Dune. To make the claim that any work of science fiction in the last half-century took cues from Herbert's seminal work would be stating the obvious, to the point of it being generally redundant. But From Software, one of the most acclaimed video game developers of the last decade, likes to do a little more than reference its influences. Whether it be Berserk or Lovecraft, From wears their inspirations on their sleeves. Such is the case with Armored Core 6, Fires of Rubicon, From's latest title, which has been paying clear homage to Dune from its very first info leak. Some parallels are so blatantly direct that I felt that understanding how Armored Core 6 ties itself to Dune and, importantly, how it distances itself from it, can be beneficial to pinning down what the game is going for at a thematic level. Armored Core 6, despite its name, is the 16th entry in the series. The game largely stays true to its long-running hyper-capitalist roots, but there is one particular plot point that sets it on a completely different narrative trajectory from its predecessors. We weren't sure what we could trust back in 2022 when the game was first leaked, but aside from some name changes, everything remains fairly spot on. I'm glad we didn't get a game called The Fires of Bashtar. But one of the most interesting parts of the leak was the reveal that the story of Armored Core 6 would revolve around a unique substance called melange. This is, in no uncertain terms, connected to the melange we see in Dune, also known as spice. And while the game itself would change the name of this substance to coral, melange was far more than just a placeholder. In Dune, melange is the most important substance in the world. To put it broadly, its discovery blasted humanity's evolution forward dramatically, improving cognitive and processing capabilities and increasing our lifespans. A significant part of Dune, especially the first book, is the political turmoil caused when warring parties clash for control of the planet Arrakis, the only place that spice can be found and harvested. Armored Core's coral serves a very similar function in setup to the spice in Dune, and this inclusion gives it a very different starting point from previous Armored Core games. Most apparent is the fact that it is set on the distant planet of Rubicon 3. Almost every past Armored Core game has been set on Earth, and the furthest we ever got from our home planet was Mars in Armored Core 2. Immediately, the world of Armored Core 6 is more alien, more unfamiliar, and more unknown even than the bleak dystopias of previous games. Like Arrakis, Rubicon 3 is desolate largely due to human intervention, and like Arrakis, powerful forces battle for control of the planet, without fully understanding the scope of what it is that they fight for. This basic premise puts Armored Core 6 parallel with Dune in ways the previous games didn't really explore, but as I said before, that isn't saying much. There are hundreds of stories about colonizers converging for control over resources. To understand just how much Dune defined the narrative of Armored Core, we need to understand coral and how it relates to melange. Everything in the world of Dune revolves around spice. In a line made exclusively for the 1984 film, it's said that he who controls the spice controls the universe. Spice is always in the audience's frame of view. It glistens in the sand as our main characters traverse the harsh deserts, and consumers of it are easily identifiable by their unnatural blue eyes. On Rubicon 3, those attuned to the coral can see it in the very sky, and machines powered by it are identified by their sinister red glow. Perhaps the most important role spice plays in the world of Dune is that it facilitates faster-than-light travel. While artificial intelligence could once safely navigate a ship through folded space, events long before we ever meet Paul Atreides led to the outlaw of thinking machines, as they are called in the book. By the events of the first novel, only specialized guild navigators are capable of interstellar travel. These navigators use copious amounts of spice to achieve a prescience that allows them to predict and avoid any possible threats. This kind of travel is impossible without them. In the world of Armored Core 6, coral is the substance that essentially facilitates the ability to pilot the titular mechs. Like spice, the advent of coral augmentation phased out the use of unmanned machines. However, it seems that this was due to the superior abilities of an augmented pilot over AI, as opposed to it being outlawed, as we still see many unmanned machines in the game. Coral is known to enhance the senses, with further effects being left vague, but it is augmented humans who primarily pilot armored cores. However, we do see that excellence as a pilot is possible without use of coral throughout the game, especially in Freud, a high-ranking corporate pilot who is described in his arena profile as simply an ordinary human being, a man who enjoys piloting his AC and making incremental improvements to his daily sorties. We already see a big difference in how coral is presented in the world when compared with spice. Melange is constantly described as a drug. It is addictive and psychedelic, and it's regularly referred to as such. When coral is introduced, it's primarily described as a revolutionary energy source and data conduit, poised to transform human society by leaps and bounds. It is indeed used as a fuel source on Rubicon 3, allowing derelict machines to run on stable energy a half-century after their abandonment. But looking past the surface, we can see that coral is even more similar to Melange than it may initially appear. On Rubicon 3, you can find people known as dozers, people who intake coral as a drug to enhance their own mental capabilities, which they call the coral's blessing. Many characters identify a spiritual connection to the coral, to the point that there even exists a school of coral mysticism for those who believe in the spiritual nature of the substance. Similarly, the religious institutions built around spice are key to the story of Dune. However, to fully understand the cultural impact that coral has, we need to understand the factions that play a part in the geopolitical structure of Rubicon 3. Once again, a war for resources is by no means something that started with Dune, but the existence of coral does somewhat shift the way these typical armored core corporations are portrayed in AC6. These games have historically featured faceless corporations that exist to represent soulless, morally blank forces exploiting a dying future. This is still the case in Armored Core 6, especially in the very first chapter where the nature of coral has yet to be explored, but we see much more humanization in this game. The two primary corporations are Balaam and Arquebus, and while both are colonizing forces that we're not supposed to root for, we do get an understanding of the personnel, hierarchy, and culture for both. We see the relationships built between agents, and we even get vague sketches of these individuals outside of their ACs. The game does not go so far as to make these corporations parallel to the Atreides or the Harkonnens, the two primary houses of the original Dune novel, but it does almost feel like warring houses of families compared with the other games. These corporations are fighting a war for control of Rubicon 3, not just exploiting an endless conflict for profit. However, one group that does match up very well with Dune is the Rubicon Liberation Front. This organization is composed of individuals who have presumably been on Rubicon for generations and who see themselves as native Rubiconians. They fight against all colonizing forces who would attempt to come in and exploit the coral. There are many parallels to be drawn between these Rubiconians and the Fremen of Dune. The Fremen are all liberal users of spice, putting it in their food and even using it to make basic household objects. They have their own agendas and have learned to ally with different factions over the centuries, but at the start they are primarily presented as enemies of colonizing forces. The Fremen are dependent on spice, especially because they live on the desolate planet of Arrakis, where every drop of water must be preserved. Similarly, the Rubiconians have relied on coral to stay alive since the fires of Ibis wiped out much of life on Rubicon 3. The world may not be as barren as Arrakis. We see plenty of trees and water, but it is clear that the Rubiconians do not have an abundant supply of food. In one log we see that they survive primarily on mealworms, which themselves need coral to grow, meaning that the corporate seizure of coral heavily impacts their food supply. In Dune, the Fremen fight with religious fervor, believing themselves to be on a holy mission to do so. In Armored Core 6, many Rubiconians refer to themselves as coral warriors and believe a divine connection compels them to protect the coral. And finally, like the Fremen with the spice, the morals of the Rubiconians and their own role in the exploitation of coral becomes more and more pronounced as the story progresses. This was only a surface-level overview of a couple of the game's factions, but you're left with a story where forces seeking power and capital fight for control over the only planet where you can find the substance they mean to harness, while the people of that planet fight back with the belief that doing so is their spiritual duty. Including such a clear analog for spice completely informed the setup for Armored Core 6 with a more transparent narrative than its predecessors. However, importantly, the game didn't keep the name Melange. They probably didn't want to get sued. But the true factor setting Coral apart from Spice was in its name from the beginning. It's alive, and it has its own agenda, and at that point, finding that out, the story takes on a completely different direction. To explore further, we would have to look into other influences that Armored Core 6 seems to have had in mind, but that would be a job for another video, and probably another channel. As I said before, Armored Core 6 is its own thing, and it is by no means trying to be a carbon copy of Dune. By the time you make your way through its 3 endings, it becomes something else entirely. But I find it intriguing to see how the presence of the word melange on a sketchy leaked document we saw nearly 2 years ago now could have shown us so much about what Armored Core 6 would be, and how one of the most famous science fiction novels of all time would help take the series in a totally new direction from what we had seen before. That is all I have for right now. If you've played Armored Core 6, let me know what you thought about it in the comments. I recently got the Platinum Trophy for it, and I had a great time all the way through. But otherwise, have a great day, and take care of yourself. There's also this giant worm. That one's kind of a gimme.